All right, everybody, thank you for your patience. Let's dive in with the next part of our presentation this morning. When you get down to it, all good journalism is storytelling at its best. We saw some really incredible storytelling for Media Storm, and if you've never checked out any of their work, please do. It's amazing photography, an amazing narrative. And we want to talk about for the next 26 minutes, which should be enough time. I'm in radio, I can do a lot with 26 minutes, is another kind of storytelling that blends investigative reporting with live theatrical experiences. And here to talk to us about their work in combining investigative reporting with theater are a reporter with Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting, Jenna Gollan, also an editor for Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting, Mr. Fernando Diaz, and the director of a groundbreaking project called StoryWorks, Jenna Welch. Let's please welcome the panel this morning. Thank you for being here to talk about what's a very interesting project called North by Inferno. Jennifer, let me start with you. How did this project come about?
Sure. So this was a result of a 6-month investigation that we did at the Center for Investigative Reporting and Reveal. It was a multi-platform investigation that ran in Politico magazine. We produced a radio piece for Reveal and a television piece for PBS NewsHour. So it was published in June of last year, and we found that top energy companies in the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota and Montana, they dodge responsibility for workers' deaths through a corporate web of relationships and weak federal oversight. And we found that at least 74 workers have died in the Bakken oil fields over the last 10 years. And just one top energy company has been held accountable for a worker's death over that period. So we decided after all of this was published and aired on television that the StoryWorks play would be a great opportunity.
I believe you have a clip to show us of part of North by Inferno.
So in this clip, you're going to see an oil field worker recounting how he went to help some of the men who were killed and injured in the worst accident in the Bakken in the last 10 years, and just the PTSD that he has suffered as a result, and also an attorney who represented the parents of a 21-year-old who was killed in that accident, describe how top energy companies try to shift blame to the workers and through other corporations to other companies when these accidents occur.
All right, now let's take a look.
Ray was a big man, and I was lifting him with a small female ambulance driver. The craziest thing is that Ray was calm after he spoke to his wife. I mean, he actually helped me by lifting up his butt when we put him on the stretcher. When he put his head back in the stabilizer, she tossed me some straps. And I went to strap his head stabilizer on, and in doing so, I sloughed the skin off of his head as if I'd scalped him. And that's one of the worst dreams I still have, because I was looking into his eyes when I did it. In my dreams, he tells me, "Don't worry. I know what you're thinking, but I didn't feel that at all. Don't worry." It's one of those dreams that will occur again and again for me until I pass from this realm into his. A window was open that will never be closed.
Now, going back to that night, son, did you follow him to the hospital?
No. I ran into a deputy on the way back and helped him find the site. The sky was still ablaze, but the roads out to the rigs had no names on them because they were oil roads, you know, like logging roads in the mountains.
And what happened after that?
After that, I returned to my site in my shed where I proceeded to drink until I passed out. I got up and tried to work the next morning, but then Ray's wife called and told me he died in the hospital, and I broke down right there and then. After seeing me like that, my boss sent me home for 5 days to recover. When I returned to North Dakota, I was fired for acting outside the scope of my employment, which I think we covered earlier or later, depending on how you look at it.
And just for clarification, Jesse, who was present on the day you got fired?
Mr. Williams, I need a moment. I mean, I never used to believe in this post-traumatic shit. But it's real. I mean, before I figured out the gloves, I could flash back out of anywhere. Nowhere. At the store, in front of my kids, at work. Anytime.
I'm sorry, Jesse.
You ever hear about the man who was drowning in the middle of the ocean, but he spent his few remaining hours trying to figure out which drops of water were to blame? You see, these companies, they may assume some liability for a few drops here and there, but they control the tides. They keep most of that catch. And floating in the wake are workers like yourselves who are blamed for swimming in the wrong direction and trying to figure out what went wrong, what they could have done to do better. Instead of leaving that rig to your workover crew, Oasis should have injected more salt water in that well, or brought in a flowback or a snubbing crew because they've been trained to deal with a well under pressure. And there isn't a blowout preventer on Earth or Venus or Mars that is designed to withstand that amount of pressure. And now, if Brendan had just been able to zip line down from that derrick, you all three could have been running away with a clear conscience and some superhuman speed, I would imagine. And you remember this. Oasis should have injected more salt water into that well. They were responsible for finding out if that well had been killed. You suspected it was under pressure, but it was their job to know for sure. Don't you blame yourself. Don't you blame each other for what happened.
Fernando Diaz, you were the editor on Jennifer's story for Reveal. Talk about the process of helping to turn that printed story into a play. What was your role?
Sure. So my role was working with Jen to ensure that the facts stayed straight. We do a lot of things, a lot of innovative things at the Center for Investigative Reporting. We're doing radio, we've done coloring books, but we don't do fiction. And so for Jen and I, it was a really intense process of looking over the scripts, ensuring day after day that changes that we thought needed to be made, conversations that we had with Jenna and John, the playwright, were incorporated into the script. And in that scene, you see accountability, technical details, blowout preventer, things that are not very poetic. And so working with Jen, was a real effort to try and ensure that the integrity of the investigation and some of the main findings, made it through the sort of artistic treatment.
Jenna Welch from StoryWorks, what drew you to this idea of combining investigative reporting with live theater?
Well, I think we struggle. I'm a theater artist, and we're constantly in the theater struggling with how we keep the work that we do relevant to what's happening right now in our society. And often it takes up to 2 years for a play from the moment the playwright starts to write it to the actors bowing on stage. And over the course of that time, a lot of things get lost in terms of how it relates to us in the immediate now. So traditionally, theater has struggled with that. I was very fortunate to be having coffee with Joaquin Alvarado, who's here, and we were talking about creating an event at the theater that I was running, Tides Theater, where we could bring our audiences and our readers and together and have cocktails and talk about journalism and art. And it was really quite clear in that conversation that we could do something more significant if we attempted to create plays based on the work that CIR had been doing. So that's how we started.
Talk about the elements that you bring to it. And by the way, we will make time for questions going forward from you before our time is up. But talk about the way in which you conceive of turning this story, which is already riveting on its own, and which is very important and has this larger kind of public message, you need to know about this, into a play with a narrative arc and all the qualities that make live theater work. How does that translation happen?
So I believe that each investigation demands its own artistic story in the sense of style. And it becomes quite clear when I start to absorb myself in the work that the journalists are doing, what that voice could be or might possibly be the best playwright's voice for this project. So there's kind of a soup of ideas and concepts that playwrights tend to be drawn to, and often an investigation could line up very well with a specific playwright style. And so finding that voice, getting them to agree to the project, which is very demanding. They have 4 weeks when the commission takes place to create their first draft, which then goes into the editorial and legal review. We're casting simultaneously, and often the shows go before their first audience within 9 to 11 weeks of the commission.
So it's a really tight turnaround.
It's an immediate artistic response.
Like insta theater. Jennifer, what were some of the challenges of turning this story into a play?
Well, I want to give a lot of credit to John Burnson, the playwright here. He worked incredibly diligently, and he was fastidious in his attention to detail. He immersed himself in all of the audio, the video, and all of my notes. Anything that I could sort of hand over, I did, so that he could quickly understand the essence of the characters that were portrayed in the play. So I think he worked very, very hard, and in many cases re-interviewed the folks that I had talked to and my sources, and developed relationships with them on his own accord, and so all of that informed the play.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the challenges of doing it, was it just kind of a matter of you handing over your notes and the finished draft and saying, have at it?
Well, my role was to ensure that the play dealt largely in facts to every extent possible, and that meant being at the plays, giving feedback as needed, and reviewing those scripts for every detail to ensure that it reflected the essence of the characters, the folks who actually worked in the oil fields and who were involved in this accident that was featured in the play, and also to honor their memories of the folks who had died, but also to ensure that we were sticking to the facts of the case. And these involved very powerful energy companies who had threatened the reporting before it was ever published. So there was a lot at stake.
And Fernando, this sounds like kind of uncharted territory for most journalism editors. I'm guessing you've never built a play from a report before. I'm assuming this is the first.
My last involvement in a play was in 8th grade.
And I'm sure you were excellent.
Unless I was attending, yeah. No, this was a riveting experience because, as Jen mentioned, John was so thorough in really trying to understand the details, and there's a lot of technical detail. I think the other part was, as I mentioned, like we deal in truth and facts, and we're sticklers for accuracy and fairness and balance, and so here it was a real push and pull between embracing and respecting creative license, which is a necessary part of theater, with the facts and with the story and with the findings that Jen had uncovered in her investigation. I think also part of it was how willing Jenna and John were to incorporating our feedback. The character there who's played Jesse the Gloves, Jesse was the guy who was helping save people, trying to save people at this accident. Ever since that day, he's had to wear these gloves, because if he's not wearing these gloves, his PTSD can trigger flashbacks to that moment. So those are actually his gloves. So one of the things was just, creating a work of quasi-fiction with real people who are actually going to see the work.
Wait, the glove, those are actually his, like the real
Yes.
The real guy
Yes.
gave you his real gloves for the stage performance.
Correct.
He gave the actor on the opening night performance. We premiered this in North Dakota and toured this production through North Dakota. So as you can see, like stylistically, it's a very minimalistic set. There's representational elements like a ladder, which becomes the rig, and different things, but so it can travel and happen quickly. In North Dakota, the central characters of the story, their families, or they themselves came to the play and participated in our conversation afterwards. And prior to the show, Jesse Stanfield gave those gloves to the actor to tell him, go with my blessing, here are these gloves that I have worn, and he wore them the first performance.
Talk about the responsibility of the theatrical team to the people whose lives you're depicting. I mean, it's not like you're doing a musical about Alexander Hamilton and he's too dead to complain if you get the facts wrong. Or you're doing a show about Kim Kardashian and who gives a shit what she thinks. Like, these are real, regular people who have gone through something genuinely traumatic, and they're sitting in the second row. And you got to get their stories right because they're looking at you.
Right. So I think that if I could quickly just talk about Abigail's reference to Icarus, there's the idea of the collective witnessing of Icarus falling into the ocean yesterday, and we talked about that. And I think that what theater does primarily is brings a group of people together for collective witnessing, and then hopefully from that we can create a dialogue amongst ourselves. And with this project, it's a 2-act play, essentially. The first act is actually the 1-act performance that you'll see, and then the second act is the conversation that we have when the lights come up with the reporters, with the community members. In this show, we're the victims and the victims' families, where we can all come together and ask questions as a temporary community and to talk about these issues. So for the people whose lives are represented on stage, it's a very delicate balance between making sure that we accurately represent their lives and incorporate them into the process so that they're actually willing to step up and sit and talk with us and share this experience afterward. So there's a preparation that I think we are figuring out. We talked a couple days ago about allowing sources to see the material before you show it in documentary film. And in this particular show, I did send the script to Peggy Wegner, which is the mother of one of the young men that was killed, and the widow of another man that was killed ahead of time, so that they could prepare themselves for coming into a situation where they were going to see their loved ones represented on stage. And that did actually affect the script. So.
It's interesting you talk about the process of going through source material, that's kind of an ongoing discussion. Is there anything else about this process where if you had it to do over again, anything you learned, anything you would have done differently, sooner, later, better, in another way, and not done at all, that maybe would influence the next time that you go about trying something like this? Fernando, anything that you learned from this that maybe you would grow on next time?
Yeah, I mean, that we can do things super fast. Which is awesome, because at CIR we tend to do long-form, long-term investigations, and as Jenna mentioned, doing this in 8 weeks was insane, but we managed to do it. I think also moving forward, what theater and what our ongoing evolution of our show reveal is showing us is that story is just so important, and Brian was mentioning that in his presentation. For so long we've depended on the findings and the facts and the outrage, and sort of, just exposing the wrong is enough. And I think what we're beginning to learn and integrate much more deeply is this element of story, right? Developing characters who are more complex, who have nuance, who aren't just bad guys and good guys and victims. So I think as we move forward, and Jen and I are talking about her next project, sort of really trying to develop more of these elements in the investigation so that we can borrow some of those elements that are very germane in other areas of storytelling, but that can make those investigations that much more memorable.
I want to go to questions in just one second, but one more question for you, Jennifer, and then if anyone has questions, we'll open it up. How do you measure success in a project like this? What does it take for you to look at something like this and say, that worked?
Well, at CIR, we measure success by impact. And in this case, it did have impact at the state and federal level. But what this play made me realize is that this is an integral component of a multi-platform approach, wherein we reached audiences that we wouldn't have otherwise. In North Dakota and in San Francisco, the shows were sold out for a week, or closely sold out for a week, and some nights. And we reached audiences that were motivated to write to their local lawmakers, to donate money to this oil field worker who you saw with the gloves, who's been traumatized by PTSD. It moved people in an emotional way that the investigation may not have, and it allowed for, the format was such that it allowed for the playwright and for the audience to understand these characters in a much more textured way. They were emotional, multi-layered characters.
And if I could just follow up with that, one of the key components of StoryWorks is the talkbacks that happen after. It's sort of like the comment section of the play. And those are incredibly powerful because it really is an opportunity for the audience to engage with the journalists, with the director, the playwright, the actors, and in North Dakota even, some of the people who were portrayed. It really is a sort of very granular, very focused, one-to-one level of impact that is much more difficult to accomplish in a sort of purely digital medium.
Let's take a few questions before our time runs out. Yes, ma'am. Oh, here, it's right over there.
Diana Henriquez, author and contributing writer to the New York Times. 2 questions, if I could. One, we kind of eluded over the balance issue, but obviously for a bulletproof investigative story, that's not trivial. When you translate a story where you've got to have the other side, you've got to give an opportunity to explain and to the targets, if you will, of the investigation. How do you move that specific element of investigative reporting into the theater experience? So that's question 1. And then just second, how is doing it, adapting the story as a theater work, different from adapting it to something that Brian would use? I mean, what's the difference between live theater in terms of impact and in terms of what you can do and what is being done so brilliantly with video on digital? Thanks.
Maybe Jennifer, if you could take the first part of that question briefly, and then Jenna, if you could answer the second part.
Sure.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to. For some of the legal considerations that we had to adhere to for the investigation, for the play, we explained Oasis's side, which was they had told us that it was basically a fluke, that there was this unanticipated flow of gas that caused the explosion. And given that we do also have some creative license with the play, that was a consideration as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in the play, it is addressed that, that Oasis's perspective, from their perspective, it was an unexpected flow of gas that caused this explosion, versus, this other theory, which is supported by some documents that said that the explosion could have been prevented if they had plugged that well properly before these men who you saw started working on it.
Mm-hmm. And I would just follow up. It wasn't the same kind of process as we conducted for the story. In the story, we shared questions via email after they repeatedly refused to talk to Jen in person or on tape. We didn't share with them passages from the script to do that same sort of vetting. But that's where we got very specific. There was a scene in which Jesse's getting fired. The way John had initially written that scene was an Oasis person firing Jesse, when that didn't actually happen. So just ensuring that Oasis's role was very clear and very deliberate, so that we wouldn't expose things that we had already vetted in the story.
And Jenna, if you take the second part of that question very briefly, and we'll try to get one more question in.
Sure. I think it's a question always like, how do you measure the intrinsic impact of art on a community? And it's a huge question. I think that the human connection and storytelling person to person is incredibly potent. And I feel like those videos that we just watched, and we've watched clips of all day, are incredibly powerful. But so is the communication that you and I are having right now, in the sense that I'm picking up social cues from you, and I'm understanding so much more about our space because we're in conversation face to face and having that. And between the play itself and then the conversation afterward, I feel like it's a very holistic experience for that.
Let's grab one more brief question. Yes, right here down front.
Hi, I'm Antonia Juhas. I'm an independent journalist and writer, and I actually specialize on oil issues. And I think just sort of want to dig in on this question a little bit more specifically in terms of the authorization of the characters in the play. So, obviously when you're writing an article, anyone who's in the article has authorized you to write about them. When you're then turning those people into characters, did you get the authorization of the people involved to put them in the play? Mm-hmm. But, yeah.
Well, the living people, of course. And not only did we ask them if it would be appropriate or okay with them for us to do that, but then we followed it up with, and would you be willing to come to California or North Dakota and be a part of it? So.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to chime in on that also?
No.
You know what, maybe one more quick question. Yes, sir, right there up top.
Very interesting stories. I'm Paul Mindus from Blue Heron Research Partners, and I was noting what Jennifer said about how people were moved by the play in ways that maybe the investigation hadn't done. Are there any takeaways you have for future investigations where some of the aspects that were put into this play will sort of be in your mind that you would want to try to capture the next time you do an investigation?
Sure. Yeah, one terrific example of how the play moved people in ways that the investigation did not was Brenda Twin was a widow of a gentleman who lost his legs and later committed suicide because of the PTSD. And she declined to participate in the investigation, did not want to be interviewed because it was too painful for her to relive that. And when she heard through word of mouth that this play was coming to North Dakota, she turned up. And it was a great example of how the play reached people in ways that the investigation did not. My takeaway from the play was that these were three-dimensional characters who were reflecting on, their emotional trauma, and some of that was material that we could have used in the investigation to build those characters, to make them more compelling, and to help the reader relate to who those people are and were.
Well, it's an amazing project. I hope we get a chance to see that play again. I hope this play circulates again so the rest of us who are interested in it can get a chance to see it. Jenna Welch is the director of StoryWorks, Fernando Diaz, an editor, and Jennifer Gollan, a reporter at Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting. Thanks for sharing the project with us. Thank you. I move we take a 5-minute recess. So ordered. We'll keep it pushing in 5 minutes.